Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you and our panelists at today's session that will focus on the new cohort of the financial market participants, and these are platforms. I'd like to thank the audience and our wonderful speakers. So let us clarify who they are, how they operate, and what are their objectives. My name is Yekaterina Golub. I will be the moderator for today's session, and I represent the Forum Analytical Center. We also have Kirill Kosminsky from the Association of Investment Platform Operators, then Pavel Pras, Infinitum Asset Services, Yekaterina Frolovicheva, Atomize, and Olga Shishlanikova, Bank of Russia.
Коллеги, чтобы нам с вами максимально эффективно, быстро и качественно
рассказать
такой огромный объем новой информации,
there's definitely a lot of items outstanding, and I'd like to jump straight into the topic. Over the past 2 years, a new subsector in the financial market has emerged, and they deal with something completely unexpected, something we've never seen. They provide services that seem to be similar to what we used to do, but they are still very much unique. Investment platform operators, digital assets operators, etc. And first of all, I'd like to give the floor to Olga Shishlanikova to give us a broad overview. Thank you, colleagues. Indeed, we have 4 new types of activities. These are platform services operators. So we have financial platform, investment platform operators. Investment platform operators, these are crowdfunding platforms. They've been entered into our register. We have 41 operators. 3/4 of them are present in the market. We do see a lot of progress in this market. There's more clients that are onboarded, both in terms of investors and in terms of borrowers that use these platforms to raise funds. So what do they do? They help to provide loans. This is the most popular type of operations of these platforms. Sub-federal bonds are also issued there to raise funds. And the third option, which is not that popular, we have just one pilot transaction. These are digital rights placement. This seems to be a classic form, but it's only emerging here in Russia, so we hope this debut will be successful going forward. And the next one, these are financial platform operators. There are 3 operators. That area has a lot of potential. There's significant demand from classic financial institutions towards these, including banks, brokerages, and insurance companies are also starting to show interest in it, and in investment funds too. We have modest results so far, but that's only because we are making our first steps, but that area, that venue is very promising. And the next one is digital financial assets and information system operators. So far we don't have any entrants, but the central bank is working actively with the first potential entrants, and it's just a matter of weeks, I guess, before we get the first entrance on this registry. Thank you. As we can see, this new generation is not very extensive, but in terms of transactions, in terms of volume and trade, well, so far it's not that much, but it's been just 2 years. Even for investment platform operators, this is not a big term. The year one was the time to figure out what the regulation is, what the legislation is. Then the pandemic broke out, and that delayed the operations. So they only went into full swing in the second half of 2020. But again, these platforms raised billions, and there's a lot of future there. There are not that many customers, and there's still time to fine-tune, streamline all the processes and mitigating the risks. Thank you, colleagues. Now, I'd like to ask Pavel. You represent the special depository. You're a classical, conventional participant of the financial market, but you also acquired a new function. You work as a marketplace. Could you please share your experience, why, and what are the prospects? Indeed, we launched this new project of a financial platform even before legislation was put in place and before the central bank's project. The first transaction was made in 2017. It's an end-to-end platform. You can buy or redeem or exchange unit investment funds. And in December 2018, that transaction was registered in the depository, in the national depository. That was a pilot project, and then we were placed on the register of platform operators. Well, it seems to be a long run, but as Olga said, it's not a big amount of time for new models. We are an open-end platform. We are a neutral infrastructure institution. And as part of the marketplace project by the central bank, this is exactly the rationale behind this. These operators need to be neutral. We need to provide a range of competitive products, offering them a choice, offering consumers a choice. Currently, we have 13 asset management companies, 48 unit investment funds, and it was initially an open platform. Going forward, would be able to achieve synergy thanks to the fact that we provide services and depository services too, and we're also a distribution function. We don't have this synergy so far, but again, it's the project itself, the marketplace platform. The project is neutral to us as an operator. There are 3 other platforms, and we provide transaction support. So this is why we're called an open-ended platform. According to our expansion plans, we do see demand from the market to distribute closed-end in unit investment funds, and we'll be part of that. And we're also looking at Russian ETFs. So that's a very interesting project. It could be incorporated in portfolios. What were the reasons initially, and why it's happening too slow? We are a transaction platform, and we rely on partnerships with other marketplaces. We don't have our own traffic. As for third-party companies, the big ecosystems around big banks, they cooperate in a closed loop, and aggregators don't treat it as the first priority compared with insurance products, for example. There's a lot of potential, but it's still going a little bit slow. Thank you. Yes, indeed, there's a lot of promise in that. Kirill, your sector, crowdfunding sector, as Olga said, this is the biggest one in terms of the number of participants. What's the current status? 41 companies, that's a very good speed in terms of implementing this business model.
Источников финансирования для предпринимателей посредством займов через инвестиционные платформы, которые измеряются триллионами, да, к сожалению, пока
cannot keep up with some of the other tools and products to raise money. So currently it's about 10 billion rubles. These are micro-lending for entrepreneurs. But we're seeing a very good curve out there. The entrepreneurs need to be aware what are the fees, what are the terms. There's still some fear because it's a bit of unknown. That's why we need to do some outreach. And we can also hope to launch a new product, crowdfunding as a pre-order. And it could be an addition to other types of lending. So people would just raise money at a platform for their projects. So it's a small accelerator. And once the startup is launched, they would then go to the banks for a loan. Usually banks require a collateral. So our operator is a very flexible tool. So on the one hand, we have the borrower or the entrepreneur, and on the other hand, you have the investor. So we'll definitely need to assess the ranking, the rating, and to see what the business is all about. So we need to strike some fine balance. And finally, I'd like to say that we do see a lot of interest to tokens. These are digital rights and digital assets. And the colleagues that deal with loans, they're actively expanding into the new areas and like to pilot run some of their products in the sandbox set up by the central bank. And the goal of the industry-specific associations and partially the regulator to make sure that these instruments are clear and safe and transparent. So, thank you. Is that a transparent tool for an average person? Well, they understand this is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is a broad term. There are areas that needs to be regulated through specific legislation. But in terms of platforms, actually there is little awareness, and we need to do a lot of outreach, buying ETFs or opening a deposit or getting a loan. So financial literacy is not really on par at the moment. Thank you. We have another participant, Yekaterina Flavicheva. Could you please share your perspective? So currently we don't have any participants of the digital rights operator, but Automize could become one. What is it all about? We are the greenest player of all the participants here. I mean, we are a freshman. So we'd like to get on the list of digital rights operators. So currently we are just a contender, an applicant, so to speak, a bidder. So we're doing a lot of teamwork, and we have to educate a lot. So currently I don't deal with any digital instruments, but I just do a lot of clarification. Whoever I deal with, fine-tuning the processes, I have to do a lot of outreach. Just saying what are the benefits, what are the pros, what are the cons, why it should be appealing to investors and issuers, what is a difference to existing tool instruments, where the financial funds will be, and why I don't do cryptocurrency. So currently, we are in this operationalizing stage. We'd like to set the stage for future growth. We're working on products, on the design. We're working on the language of the rules together with the central bank. So we are trying to get a 360 degree of our products so that as we enter the market, we need to be transparent to our average investors, and according to the stats from May, currently there are more than 10 million active investors on MOEX. That's quite impressive, and we hope it will grow, and they will use diversified products out there. This is why if we become an operator, we would make sure that we have the technology that is appealing, and the safety. That will be another important factor. So we would give you a financial instrument. It's a token, basically. In order to buy it, you need to come to a special place. It's a digital place. So I'm trying to explain it to you in very simple terms. You need to register there. So you have a full profile as a citizen. Then you have to top up your digital wallet and then pick the instrument that you like. It seems to be simple, plain vanilla steps, but how do you do it? How do you explain it to average investors? That's the biggest challenge. Thank you. It's a completely new area, and we hope that our investors, who are very much advanced actually, would like to try it out and get a taste of the new financial instrument. Colleagues, we now move to an area which is of great concern to the regulator, not just to the regulator. Consumer and investor protection rights. There are new instruments, a lot of unknown things. To the newcomers or even those who have had some track record of trading on MOEX. How do we protect investors? Let's start with Kirill. He represents a sub-industry which has the biggest number. What are you doing in this area? How do you make sure this is safe and transparent? Unfortunately, we don't have the same numbers as MOEX. It's not 10 million. Currently, it's about 30,000 people who are either registered or in the wait-and-see mode, sitting on the fence. You threw in a nice twist in your question. Consumer and investor protection, that's a big concern for the regulator and the market participants themselves. Take investment platforms. They realize that once you have investors who are unaware or think that they invest in one thing and get quite a different thing, that could lead to turmoil. Many are not ready for defaults, and the management of the platforms need to do a lot of education. If you're not ready for defaults, this tool is not for you.
Это диверсификация, все равно, что вы не инвестируете в одну акцию, да, если весь портфель у вас состоит из одной акции.
Imagine if you invest in one stock. It doesn't mean, it would mean you don't have any diversification. So you need to be able to diversify a portfolio. In our case, we have issuers and we have investors and we have borrowers who are entrepreneurs. Sometimes the rules are drafted in favor of investors, but the borrowers are also afraid. What happens if the investor grabs my collateral? So you just need to set out that balance, that equilibrium in the terms. The platform is not interested in investors getting hold of the collateral. This is why any platform needs to come up with their own guidelines that would ensure the interests of both parties. And there are two more parties. It could be those who provide financial services on other platforms, the regulator that seeks to ensure the resiliency of the financial system in general, and we also need to make sure we don't have any regulatory arbitrage, so that some current participants don't re-register as other platforms to create new risks. And third is the government itself, the state, because there is a broader goal of supporting entrepreneurs, providing affordable financial resources. So we need to provide incentives, tax breaks, financial intermediary regulation, which is convenient and comfortable for everyone. Thank you. This is a sensitive issue indeed. Since we are talking about retail investors, we need to remind ourselves of the huge number of those on MOEX. And I'd like to give the floor to the front row participant who's online with us, who represents MOEX, and I'd like to give the floor to him, Igor Alutin. I hope he can hear us, I hope we can hear him. Igor Alutin, who's the managing director at MOEX. Igor, our topic today is platform business. You do have a platform. As a representative of MOEX, you are well aware of how we should protect investors who are interested and will be interested in new services, platform services. Over to you. What's your perspective? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, I represent MOEX. Currently, the overall goal is to improve financial literacy. That was a goal that was set by the central bank. We have a dedicated training module called The Path of the Investor. We expect a total number of 15 million people on MOEX by the year end. These people need to know what kind of instruments they buy, and we need to educate them. We need to educate these individuals. We became the first operator of a financial platform. We launched the retail segment. We don't just design a platform that brings together the suppliers, the financial ministry, banks, but also the aggregators. We have our own marketplace, finservices.ru, and clients can come and buy any new product, and we'll be able to train them, to educate them, so that investors know what kind of instruments they buy.
We are a remote platform. We are not inventing any financial instruments of our own. We are only only selling those products that we are distributing. We have more than 10 banks on board. By the end of the year, we're going to onboard 10 more, and including insurance companies as well, and we are already effecting about 50,000 transactions per month. It's important for us to do some risk profiling of a client and to show to the client what he or she can do. If you're talking about saving, then for some conservative clients it would be a deposit, but when a client is ready for a more complex product, we will be sending that client to the broker, but in the process we are going to educate that client, and this is the essential part of our presence in the market. Thank you. Indeed, this is quite interesting. Your educating mission and your assistance to the investing client would produce some good outcome, when we would see, hopefully, a very good story of investing. Yuri, what would you think? Well, we are operating in some traditional financial products, and I think that the Bank of Russia in recent years has done a lot in terms of protecting the rights of consumers. And this is efforts to stop any bad faith transactions, risk profiling, etc., etc. So in principle, in this area, we have done a lot already, so that investors' rights are protected. It does not mean that platforms like ours shouldn't do anything else. We need to support such initiatives and such efforts. We need also to take part in communications. Much depends on communication and transparency to the consumers, and providing information to the consumers about a product, about the suppliers and sellers of such products. Looking forward, maybe this is not direct, but we need to be talking about some good characteristics and elements of products when we offer a choice, not like slavery and being hooked onto one single product, but we need to provide a range of those. There is also something indirect from the participants to ensure continuity and the reliability of operational services. It is no wonder that the operators of such platforms have very high standards of cybersecurity and reliability of their platforms. A combination of such measures is something that in the domain of investment into financial products would be very essential, and probably looking forward we can expect even better protection of the rights of consumers. Ekaterina, you don't have any investors yet, but this is something that you are contemplating, I believe. Why your platform is going to be better than others? Here I would probably be talking about some architecture. We, as a regulated entity, have some mandatory functions that, to me, would be also characteristics of a high risk culture. The thing is that we do now have functions that many people would not really think about too much. We have a directive for financial monitoring, we have a risk director, and we also have an operational director. And these are the three pillars of a high-level culture of risk management. And the way our technological platform is evolving, it is based on some principles of security, reliability, and these are also quite important. And third, I'm talking about operational processes, how we present and offer instruments to the investors. We do have a policy of dividing investors into qualified and non-qualified, and this is one of the first documents that was actually approved and agreed upon even before we entered the market. And also, what is important is to have information, because even when you provide some premium services to clients, but when they are working with you remotely, we need to provide them with all the information about risks, and we need to provide the description of the issue of financial instruments. And while developing an instrument, we're not really let it go freely and self-flowing. It's like the issuer and the client would agree on something between themselves, because this is going to be sort of like a creative chaos. And I'm in favor of a systemic approach. So in this whole system of relations, we are like the verifier of sorts, and we certify, and hence those operational functions are there with us. Internal control, operational risks, operational processes, and risk management. And this is where I see the possibility of protecting the rights of clients. We are quite a responsible player. And on top of that, there's also the question of penetration of such information, accessible information, which can be easily comprehended. I'm more or less taking records of those good artifacts, but I'm thinking about how to apply those practices of infographics to, convey some message. You come in, you see those infographics, and then you sign a document. So that this should be quite a normal standard feature of our work. This is the main element of development of such players and ecosystems of such players. We did not really plan to have a presentation from Olga Yurievna, but maybe we have a question to the regulator. We are being asked, Alexander Detkov is asking this question. What would be the liabilities on a deposit which was mobilized through a platform when a license is revoked? So what would happen to the participants in the platform? Well, when a platform is revoked its license, this would not mean that this is the end of the commitments and liabilities to the investor. There might be some challenges that the law now ensures that liabilities will have to be carried out through the platform and its accounts, but with the cease of operations by the operator of a platform, there might be some delays. We are actually now fine-tuning the process so that it will not affect the investors, but investors will keep all their rights and liabilities, but their liabilities would then be done in a classical mode. And I can see that the regulator is still watching closely what would happen to the platforms. Indeed, we have our hand on that, and thank God we have not had such incidents so far. Well, I understand that the regulator, the participants in the platforms and members of the platforms actually thought ahead of time as to what might happen in the case of a default. And colleagues, what happens next? Indeed, the sector is only mushrooming. The laws are quite fresh, and your operations only started. But there are also challenges, and we really want to look forward to see what would be the tasks and challenges and the needed changes in regulation that you see, although that regulation is quite new as well. Ekaterina, perhaps I'll start with you, because you have the
используете? Что вы полагаете, может быть, видите сейчас уже какие-то?
One of the most
Да, действительно, спасибо, очень хорошо.
updated views of what may expect us in the future. Indeed, this makes me to mobilize myself because indeed, while we were preparing for our launch, we actually were also thinking about how our products are going to be launched, several of those. And as part of such preparation, we more or less also started to analyze the setup of the tax landscape so that it might not really incentivize the behavior of people at the platform or through the platform. I'm talking about the application of VAT to transactions, or maybe also the CIT that might be imposed on the life cycle of those products. In this regard, we do hope very much that there would be some fruitful effort by the legislators and at the International Economic Forum. The legislators claim that we will be having some amendments to the tax code this coming fall, which would be comfortable for the expansion of such players as ours. This would also be possible and beneficial for crowdfunding. I think that this might be quite useful for the development of our platforms. My second story, and I see this as very important, in terms of investor rights protection, this is the requirements for security, for cybersecurity to such players as us. Since we don't have any reference or benchmarking or models there that you can use, it would be nice to develop such an approach to think about the applicability of cybersecurity requirements. But such requirements should be introduced in a phased way so that it would be commensurate to the number of users. Well, I mean, we only have like 3 users, for example. You are just a week young, and you still have to really meet all those tight cybersecurity requirements. And third point is very close to me. We are a non-credit financial institution. So to us, it would be important to think about how to mobilize clients and how to identify ourselves. The verified records, the identification, or any other forms of identification, including biometric, would be quite important and handy to such players as ourselves. This would make us quite easy to access and understandable. So an entry in the Gosuslugi portal would be of much help to us. For example, people who actually had their vaccination, they have a record in the Gosuslugi personal office, and we would love to have the same in relation to us. Well, thank you very much. Kirill, before giving you the floor, let me read a question from the audience. The volume of lending through investment platforms is still very low compared to other forms and ways of investment. How can we increase the confidence of investors and consolidate interest in such platforms? It's not really about confidence, it's about having some informed decision. We are talking about some dozens of thousands of registered users. So people perhaps know about ourselves, but they may not be always confident in us. Well, maybe they are not really drawn by the rate, or maybe they are not carried away with the rate that is several times higher than the interest rate on the deposit. People may not be trusting that. People are apprehensive that something may happen to the platform. And indeed, we heard here that there will be some measures taken so that the users who are not confident enough in us would hear that if something happens, there will be a mechanism that would not stop any payments on loans, although that was the story even in the past. If a bank was revoked its license, nothing really happened to the deposits of the depositors. So it's not about trust. Of course, there is such a question, but it's a question of communication. And infographics is actually an ideal way of communicating to the clients. And this is something that we need to use more often and broader, because we need to describe our instruments. There are secure loans, there are short-term loans that you take to, for example, meet any public procurement orders, which actually envisage a very short delivery times, but then you'd have some unknown corporation, and you need to be looking for information about such companies, maybe in some registers, etc. On a regulatory basis, we need perhaps to subsidize the effort of SMEs to get their ratings or to get their assessment. We do have a lot of big data through cash registers, through cards, because there's a lot of payment being done through the online platforms, but we can use those assessments and estimates to see what would be the probability of something happening to the loan, of what is exactly is going to happen to it. I would support Ekaterina in that we need to have some pro rata regulation. If you're talking about some small volumes with several thousand of clients, perhaps we need somehow to phase out the or phase in the requirements for such platforms. But how to really implement this in practice, this is the question to the regulator. So we also had, well, I mean, they're still carrying out this tax guillotine in a number of sectors, but the question of taxes is very important. Through investment accounts, I understand that they're trying to lift any privileges and concessions on the investment into foreign stock. Maybe those can be rather replaced with the incentives offered for the investments into Russian platforms, which is actually more relevant to Russian entrepreneurs. Quite recently in the Sverdlovsk region, we had an expert roundtable on investment platforms, with a very interesting model being used there when the entrepreneurial support fund was a co-founder of an investment platform. There was an interesting point there that investors were saying that through the platform which was established, we do not know those borrowers whether they are good or not, whether they are good faith or not. And say we would have invested into a support fund, then we would have more trust there, and then you would be managing the portfolio. Of course, this fits not too well with the existing architecture, but how to do that, we may give it another thought. It would be a good impetus and a push to the investment of money that people actually invest in the stock market with its inherent risks, and such investment, such money can be diversified and sent into this investment mechanism. And another question, can individuals be able to invest into the venture mechanisms using the platforms? Yes, there is already such a platform available, one, and there will be others. What is a venture investment? Small and medium-sized companies may be floating their stock to mobilize investors. There is such a mechanism available under the Russian law, but the question is, the issue is about confidence and trust. So if a venture company wants to use the platform and its services, it is possible. Yes, of course. Pavel, in your opinion, what is needed and or not needed in regulation? You know, the law is quite young. But claiming that there is some critical barrier to the execution and exercise of that law, I think it's premature. Of course, there are some small wishes that still need to be met. For example, it would be good for us as the operator of the platform not to be an agent in the language of Federal Law 156, and because this imposes on us some unnecessary documentary requirements, etc. Every time you'll have to put this information into various documents, and this takes time. But anyways, this is not anything critical. We're working in the status where the operators, where we are the operator and the agent, but something really for discussion. Globally speaking, we are supportive of a number of proposals that are already available from the reports of the Bank of Russia. And all those seamless transitions and transfers, all of that plays into the hands of the platforms and their cross-integration. To us, another big wish or another big chunk of our efforts would be to implement all those requirements of informational reliability and cybersecurity. It takes a lot of effort and time, but this is something that is needed to be done, so nothing to comment there. We will be implementing those. What else? Well, our plans of integration with the other platforms, there's nothing on the way of doing that, but maybe in the future there will be questions about the interaction with the financial transaction operators as players in some configurations and setups, so we need to be also talking and discussing some tariffs and rates. Every product has its own margin in terms of commission fees, and of course sometimes it is not always too comfortable. This is now critical. I mean, we can agree on those tariffs, but something really to discuss. In terms of taxes, I think that everything is quite clear. Well, thank you very much, and in conclusion, indeed, time flies, but Olga, my final question is to you, which really relates back to some other questions that we still have from the audience, and the questions are about the risks of kind of like combining the roles of a platform and the role of a professional market player. Would there be a contradiction there? Perhaps, responding to the wishes of the participants in the market that were expressed here in the studios, we thought that the regulation that we established is very minimal today. And the representative of the classical markets would confirm that classical institutions have a much higher regulatory burden, which we are trying to alleviate, and we thought that the burden on the platforms is much lower, but we heard that something may be improved. We will be looking into that, although indeed requirements are quite minimal. Maybe informational security is a point to discuss, whether we can use some pro rata regulation there. But what do we see in terms of future developments? We see that the platform, and this brings us back to the question of the way platforms operate, and they have very similar risks to the other mechanisms. But there are three laws, three bylaws, three regulations. Unfortunately, they not always have the same approach, and that is why it is difficult to combine the operational activity in other platforms and the classical business. There we see actually a good room for improvement. historical experience shows that we had the same about exchanges. Our regulation was first about the type, was based on the assessment of the type of activity, whether it was like a time market, etc. But then we decided that it should be quite universal. Then we would also be looking for some common traits of platforms and what can be made universal and unified in terms of our approaches to platforms, and combining this link with the operatorship business would probably improve. Another big area where we have good room for development. These are the rules of the operation of platforms. We don't have many rules right now, so the main focus now on regulation would be on the rules. It would be a rules-based regulation, and we hope that platforms, through their self-organization, would develop their standards. If they cannot do that, we would be helping them in terms of regulation, because this is the main mechanism of for onboarding investors, and also if you remember a classical Soviet movie of Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, where one of the characters said that TV will be replacing everything, theaters, ballets, etc. So TV will be everywhere. So maybe platforms would be that same TV, but in the future, that it would replace everything. And maybe using such instruments, we would see in the marketplace from the other sectors, like IT companies. Colleagues, thank you very much. It was a wonderful session. We heard so many new things, and I thank you all, and goodbye.
Всем добрый день.
Hi everyone,
Приветствовать наших зрителей.
welcome to our session. My name is Sergey Larin. I'm the founder
Сегодня
and the manager of C-Bonds.
секции, которая
It's a
называется
news agency on the financial market. And I will moderate a session called Limits of Regulating Information Services in the Financial Market. I was a bit perplexed by the name,
рыночного сектора экономики.
as any participant of the financial market. I don't really like the word regulating, but as I talked to central bank representatives, I realized it is an exciting topic. There are areas which we could discuss, and I'm interested in it as a representative of the news agency. So there are some areas where we can debate. So we have today Larisa Selutina from the Bank of Russia, Tatiana Yasaulkova, CEO of the Special Depository SDK Garant, Alexey Avdeyev, who represents Refinitiv here in Russia.
Инноваций, данных и платформ.
He's head of innovations, data and platforms.
Он уже на подъезде. Игорь Марич.
And Igor Maric will join us soon. He's from the Moscow Exchange. And we also have Yevgeny Serdikov, CEO at St. Petersburg Exchange.
Сконцентрировать на двух основных вопросах.
So I was asked to focus on two key areas. First, we're very much accustomed to a situation where we have just one exchange, MOEX, that's it.
Каждому финансовому активу есть вот, собственно,
And for each financial asset, you have just one price,
на московской бирже.
defined or discovered at Moscow Exchange. Right now,
Становится как минимум две.
there are at least exchanges because the St. Petersburg Exchange now offers foreign stocks,
Чтобы развивать торговлю российскими
and
ценными
they would like to provide trading in Russian stocks. So we now have to get accustomed to a new reality where we have two stock exchanges and OTC trade and OTC information. That's another area. Take Eurobonds when the price is discovered not at exchanges but OTC, over the trade.
предоставляемые дата-вендорами. Сейчас в основном в качестве этих
And over the counter, sorry. And data vendors are currently mainly represented by foreign companies. The key ones are Bloomberg and Refinitiv. But as a representative of C-Bonds, the Russian data representative, I'd like to jump on the bandwagon and be part of this process and could operate on some level terms with the big guys like Bloomberg and Refinitiv. And this is why perhaps we need some regulation from the central bank, and regulation will only benefit our industry. I'd like to narrow down our topic to news items, to information and analysis. We don't talking about best execution, routing, and brokers. We only talk of how we deal with data. Let's start with the first item. What do we do when there's more than one stock exchange? What prices, what quotes should be used? How to choose just one in terms of quotes? How do you select a key exchange as the main one, maybe where there's more liquidity? Maybe we need to use an average price based on the volume. Let's start with Alexey. Refinitiv is present, I guess, in all countries of the world, including in those countries where there are more exchanges than one. So could you share the experience of other countries? Thank you for this question. Indeed, Refinitiv is present in more than 190 countries and economies around the world. True, we work in countries where there are several platforms, several exchanges, and there are different
И совершенно правильно вы, Сергей, сказали,
different
что,
attitudes.
действительно применяются разные методы. Где-то
Sergey, you're right. Sometimes
основной биржи в качестве
one exchange is selected as the key source of data. Sometimes you have
расскажу о том, какие есть
averaging of price. So could you please bring up my slide?
подвержены не только котировке, но также и информация о сделках, которые происходят
You can
и мы это наблюдаем
aggregate information on quotes and on transactions. That's what we see in the US, Canada, Australia.
будут действовать определенные рыночные правила.
There will be some market rules applied
И эти рыночные правила формируются и
in every country, and these market rules are adopted
при агрегации котировок и
and accepted by the market
Вот
participants.
действительно правило, что мы считаем
Now,
взвешенную,
if it's
среднюю,
a close price,
средневзвешенную,
we could look at the weighted average price from the two exchanges.
применяем правила.
Sometimes we, as Refinitiv, use the primary RIC. We have
Инструмент код, который
Reuters instrumentive code.
определяет цену, источник цены,
That's a
цены
code
конкретной бумаги.
that
И среди
defines
всех
the price for a
источников
specific
ценной бумаги
stock.
мы выбираем
And we
одну
choose just one
конкретную,
specific
конкретный источник.
quote, one specific source.
Далее есть также поле для регулятора, потому что есть
And there's room for regulation because some rules and principles that the regulator could recommend or introduce or mandate. Take Australia. They have these
ценным бумагам,
Securities Commission,
комитет, прошу прощения.
sorry, committee, the Securities and Investment Committee,
Необходимо сделать национальный агрегатор,
and it says, okay, we need a national aggregator, best bid offer.
В этой ситуации одна из бирж взяла на себя,
And one of the
она
exchanges
будет репортить другую
has assumed the responsibility that it would report to the other exchange its own quotes, the best quotes,
Вторая биржа,
and the
соответственно,
second exchange would then release it as a data flow.
что мы как вендоры,
There are
например,
other options. We as vendors, as we see
эту агрегацию.
investor demand, we do this aggregation on our own. We just take the platforms that are available to us, and we usually work with all the key platforms,
Делаем эту агрегацию по понятным
and do this aggregation according to a
либо там у нас
plain methodology. It's either approved by the market or approved by the regulator.
представляем лучшие котировки от разных
That's our way to provide the best bid and offer
котирования этих данных, потому что не каждый
from our sources. But there's license, it could be licensing issues.
клиент будет видеть лучшие котировки только с тех источников, на которые он подписан.
So our customer may only see the best quotes from those sources that they have license to use.
Как я уже сказал, допустим, в Австралии это биржа, в
In Australia, it's the exchange that is the aggregator. In Canada, we act as the aggregator. In the US, there are associations
определяют правила, куда входят в
that play this role. They define the rules,
данном случае биржи,
and all the sources, in this case exchanges, they define the rules, and then they
через одну из бирж, через
send this, share this consolidated tape through one of the platforms, maybe NASDAQ, for example. Okay, now let's ask Igor to comment on it. You represent MOEX. Currently, that's our number one choice and will remain to be number one choice, number one
главной биржевой площадкой нашей страны.
for Russian investors.
Как видите для себя эту ситуацию? Вы будете вот в русле того,
What's your
что говорил
take?
Алексей, кооперироваться
Will you
с
cooperate,
другой биржей?
as Alexei said, with the other exchange or exchanges to aggregate their data
в свой дата-фид и
in your data feed so that your data feed could be well recognized,
отведете эту роль
or maybe
мне, Блумбергу,
it will be done by Bloomberg, me, Refinitiv, Interfax, or any other vendor? Or do you believe that MOEX will remain the key source of liquidity and you don't need to
пользоваться вашими данными, и вы имеете возможность других
you don't need to aggregate the data, you can just ignore everyone else? Thank you, Sergey. Hi, everyone. It's a great platform at the International Financial Congress. Some say that information is the new oil, and financial information is like our blood, which is more important.
Мы, естественно, стараемся всегда замечать всех вообще, в принципе,
We
в первую очередь, особенно наших клиентов.
tend to not to ignore anyone. We are customer-centric. As for price information,
То это действительно вопрос очень
this is indeed a multifaceted question. For us, information, price information, is what we produce as a product. It's a valuable product to us.
Это то, что необходимо нашим клиентам для того, чтобы торговать на бирже.
Definitely, our customers need it to trade in the market.
А это очень разные
All the
клиенты.
clients, and they are diverse, those who trade, those who use information in research purposes, in accounting,
Они все в конечном
tax
счете,
purposes.
у них несколько разные потребности в
They have different needs.
характеристиках. Но они все заинтересованы в том, чтобы это
But
была наиболее справедливая.
their shared interest is to make sure this is a fair, the real price.
Рынок, он довольно сложный, и
And the market is complex, as you know. In the different segments, it's fragmented
и поэтому здесь,
in
естественно,
different ways, to different extent.
хочется получить,
But in any case, it is fragmented.
опять же, в зависимости от цели его деятельности,
And sometimes, depending on the goals,
получить разную ценовую
our customers would like to get
Здесь мы,
varied
во-первых, стараемся сделать наш информационный продукт более качественным.
pricing information. This is why we try to make sure our product is of top quality. First is
Это должно быть самое справедливое
liquidity. This has to be the most fair price based on liquid trade.
информационный продукт,
It
который
should be a news product that is convenient for consumption. So you need to come up with the right format. Third,
клиентам предоставлять и уже
we are ready, and we've been providing third-party news products. It's not just quotes.
является следствием наших торгов. Хотя
Quotes that
это
are based on our trades, on trade on MOEX.
мы берем информацию,
We also
в том числе
provide third-party data.
некоторые расчетные аналитические
It could be research, calculations, information. We have the dedicated research center that operates as part of our group,
которая для него наиболее релевантна, с учетом
the
ликвидности,
National Settlement Center.
рынке высокой, достаточно высокой, я бы сказал, и так далее.
Sometimes you don't always have
Информационные агентства,
high liquidity.
то для нас
That's an
это,
issue.
естественно, ключевые партнеры.
As for the research agencies, they are key partners for us, so we use some of their information. But we regard them as vendors that also take our information to then distribute to a broader range of investors, packaging it in the right way. Do we want to provide our information and someone else's information? Well, as I said earlier, yes, we do believe that. If we can add value, then why not? We are ready to cooperate with third parties.
Касающаяся информации, это то, в принципе, откуда эта информация
But where
идет.
do we take this info and how it is then used by investors?
Потому что вот то, что то, что мы уже начали обсуждать, как это работает в Америке, в
So
Европе,
we heard reports of how it operates. The system is run in the US, Canada, in Australia.
усилить конкуренцию,
Initially, they wanted to
в общем-то,
tighten
создать
competition,
фрагментацию.
and this is why they fragmented the liquidity initially, and then they started thinking of how they combat that, because it proved harmful for price discovery for investors and
Там, да, вот слово,
began
этих возможностей
to affect
по справедливой цене. И поэтому
their
серьезно
ability
сейчас
to
мы видим, общаясь с нашими
do
коллегами,
transactions at fair
которые активно участвуют в этих европейских дискуссиях,
price. So we work with European partners, and regulations currently geared to fight this best execution
ну, может быть, не всегда добросовестными
interpretation, misinterpretation.
площадка старается
Sometimes there are bad practices. One trading platform is trying to
на ликвидности другой площадки
cannibalize on the liquidity of another platform by not creating any value
формирование, да, вот этой ликвидности и цены. В смысле, там,
in terms of liquidity and this pricing,
бумаг на листинг,
in terms of access of securities to the listing and
такой вопрос очень
providing liquidity to it. So this is a multifaceted question.
Ну, на разных сегментах, допустим, на валютном рынке у нас фрагментация традиционно очень высокая.
In FX you've got a lot of fragmentation. We are one of the pools of liquidity, and our clients decide for themselves what pools of liquidity they would like to aggregate in accounting, in trading, etc., etc. But there are still indicators that we produce and we distribute those indicators on the stock exchange. As of today, we don't have any issues with fragmentation of liquidity. St. Pete's trades in foreign stocks for dollars. We trade Russian stocks and foreign stocks for rubles. Can we partner? Yes. What about best execution? What about best customer experience that brokerage try to offer? Well, that's a fair question. Let's wait and see. It's critically important to understand that our end consumer should be aware what they choose. They need to have the final say. What is the price? What are the caveats in every transaction? This is why we need to provide the best customer experience to protect the interests of their interests. Thank you so much, Igor. Now, we have Yevgeny Serdikov, CEO at St. Petersburg Stock Exchange. What's your perspective, the perspective of an alternative exchange?
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Меня слышно?
Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope you can hear me.
Всех вас видеть, слышать.
It's a great pleasure to see and hear all of you, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to take part in this dialogue.
Наверное, слова Игоря, что диалог.
I'd like to repeat what Igor said. This dialogue is increasingly important, and
информационных сервисов
information services
интересно и полезно для
is becoming increasingly relevant for the Russian stock market.
Перейду к делу. Во-первых, хотел бы сделать маленький каминг-аут. Дело в том, что во время моего участия в дискуссиях в онлайн-формате мой взгляд всегда обращен чуть выше взглядов других
I usually look a little bit above the camera.
действительно высокий в жизни. Но
I'm a tall person, but it's not because of that. It's because my video camera is embedded in my keyboard. This is why it's looking from below, and I seem to be taller and looking above you. I'm sorry for that.
Информация должна как-то агрегироваться в мире.
Our colleague said that we need to aggregate information. There are a lot of pools of liquidity around the world. But on the other hand, I would like to talk in general of the accessibility of information, in terms of how easy it is to distribute information, how easy it is to ensure best execution.
И тут важным вопросом является не только и не столько агрегация информации.
And it's not just about aggregation.
В состоянии сделать информационные
It could be done by news vendors and other market participants. But first and foremost, it's about the number of sources.
Предоставляется информация. Это право использования возможность права использования информации, которую предоставляют различные биржи, и Санкт-Петербургская биржа, и Московская биржа,
provided by MOEX and St. Petersburg Exchange to do prop trading or to help out your customers.
В системах внутреннего учета.
And again, it's also important for accounting.
Является тарифообразование на информационные сервисы. И мне кажется,
the fee matrix is also important for data services.
И право использования информационных сервисов, он очень важный.
Fees and rights these are two important issues. So I'd like to go back to the history of the stock market in Russia. As we know, in the 1990s, there was an attempt to set up two exchanges with different business models. First, monetization would be achieved through the sale of market data, and it was the RTS stock market. Data services, quotes, were the key product. The transactions were done for free, and monetization was achieved through the sale of expensive trading terminals to a narrow group of market participants, and they used their mini-monopolistic position, and they could force prices to their high prices to their consumers. Then the second business model was monetization through the fees for transactions. It was MySex. At MySex, data services were just most often a free product. It was a second priority product. MySex helped to increase it drove an increase in investors and the number of transactions, and it beat RTS. And then MOEX took over. So for a long time, data was available for free for retail investors. This is why it helped to onboard so many investors, and we're really happy. 10 million investors. That's shared. The number is shared between two platforms. And our investors were able to replace foreign funds, and this is why we haven't seen any decline in the Russian stock exchange, and capitalization of the Russian stock market actually has grown. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're pretty much limited in time. Please give me a couple of minutes. So MOEX started to replicate the experience of other exchanges and started to introduce fees. And we had some of the market participants, could you please stop our activities to provide trading for Russian stocks so that we have alternative sources of information. That's what we did. So our actions were driven by the market participants. This is why we have two platforms with alternative sources of information. But the exchanges remain to be transparent in terms of service. And Igor was right. Around the world, there are always new exchanges, ECNs, brokers, and broker internalizers for new, relevant instruments. Bid-offer spreads are being cut. That adds new benefits to investors, and internalizers are not transparent in terms of data services. Many retail brokers have come up with these internalizers, and it's inevitable. We saw this in the ruble-dollar FX pair. There's a lot of liquidity in MOEX, but most broker banks started to set up their own internalizers, and trade there is higher than on MOEX, and Sber's platform is equal to MOEX, I mean in terms of dollar-ruble pair. So within a couple of months, Sber's internalizer will also have the
Если он еще
stock
не
market.
стартовал, то уж точно в ближайшее время стартует.
It will
После Сбера
launch
делают
very
то же
soon.
самое конкуренты. В
It will be
перспективе
followed
года
by competitors.
основной
In the next 2
оборот
years,
торгов на рынке
the
ценных
key
бумаг
trade in
будет
the stock
приходиться
market will not be
на
done
рынке
on
российских ценных бумаг, будет приходиться не на
not on MOEX,
на брокерские
but on
интернализации.
brokers, internalizers, as
Мы,
they
с
are
одной
known.
стороны, приветствуем
We welcome
такое повышение ликвидности. Это все
this
будет
increase in liquidity,
способствовать сужению bid-offer спредов для
and
клиентов.
that
С
will
другой
definitely
стороны,
drive bid-offer
как
spreads
биржи
down. But we as
прозрачные,
exchanges, transparent platforms,
и в то же время мы
and
считаем
we
необходимым
believe
создание
that
условий
it's
для
needed to set
максимальной
up conditions
доступности
for
ценовой
maximum
информации
availability
со
of
стороны
quotes
не только бирж традиционных, но
Not only to the traditional exchanges, but also to some internal agents, so that clients are transacting with the principles of best execution. Thank you, Evgeny,
Ваше мнение? Давайте мы дадим слово Татьяне
for your opinion. Now let's give the floor now to Tatiana Yasaulkova of the Special Depository of Garant. You are servicing institutional investors like the unit funds, but how do you see the situation in relation to a security where you have two sources of pricing or quotes on that? We, as a specialized depository, in our daily operations calculate the market value of the assets of our clients. And when we see that some stock is traded in several exchanges, usually these are the foreign stocks, we are trying to identify the priority market for such stocks. And the principal market is determined in the following way. The market which has the highest volume of trading in such as stocks, and we also monitor the activity in the market in terms of the number of transactions or the number of participants or any other parameters can be used. So when we identify a principal market, we take the quotes from that particular market or exchange. Another exchange for the Russian stock would not really be a problem for us. We are prepared for that. Only thing that we need to do is to more or less change our standard for ESJ, and where the principal market is Moscow Exchange, and then we need to change it if needed. Larissa, maybe I should give you the floor so that you can briefly sum up what has been said and also provide the opinion of the Bank of Russia on that. Yes, thank you. Indeed, the very subject of informational services is something that is being actively debated, and the regulators across the world are focusing on that as well. In the modern era of algos and high speeds and data transfers, this is an essential part of any financial market. And I would agree here with Igor that exchange information has remained for many years the most widely spread and recognized source of information, because this was the most realistic way of getting such information. Indeed, the Russian market was and has been quite centralized for a long time, but now it is being fragmented, and we may see the emergence of several platforms selling and listing the same product, and our legislation provides for such double listing. This is also driven by the integration between the exchanges of different countries. Well, the very fragmentation of the market would not be something that we need to really be apprehensive of. It is the natural evolvement of a market, and this provides some broader opportunities to the progress. It may also deepen the liquidity, and depending on the many factors and peculiarities of the markets. But overall, we believe that this fragmentation is an important element of improving competition in the market, which we believe to be very important for us. Of course, this may also cause a number of risks because we don't have a single benchmark to calculate prudential requirements or to do some corporate action to, for example, buy back stock or even to really identify the taxable base. How to minimize and mitigate such risks? This may be mitigated through the consolidation into a single flow of price data from the trading of different traders. This can be done through the platforms of the exchanges themselves, based on the exchange of such price data, but this can also be organized by the integrator of exchange transactions. Any solution is possible, but the price should be feasible and not a burden on the user. We are moving towards that in terms of regulation. We're going to discuss that with the market players, how to establish such standards, because this would change the architecture of the market of sorts. We need to somehow agree on where to aggregate such information and who is going to do that, what would be the requirements to the providers or aggregators of such information. But this is a trend that we can observe globally.
So
I would say much awaits us in future in this very new area. Larissa, thank you very much. Interestingly, you mentioned CIS exchanges, but in Kazakhstan, for example, the exchange that is called KASE, the most liquid papers like Gazprom, are admitted for trading through the Kazakhstan exchange. The liquidity there is, of course, cannot be compared to the one at MOEX, but we, as a data vendor and Definitive as well, probably is doing the same. We are getting such data, aggregate those, and present to our clients. Coming to the second point, and please be even more brief than we were in commenting on the first question. We really only have 18 minutes left, and we are still receiving questions also to I'm getting that to my moderator's tablet, and I really would like to have some time to discuss those questions. So the second question is the OTC pricing and data. This is mostly about Eurobonds, but also to some other classes of stock. For Eurobonds, in a number of the regulations of the Bank of Russia, it is said that you need to be using the prices and quotes received from the information systems of Bloomberg and Reuters. This is a historical fact. So such kind of like a requirement is going from one regulation to another. You do have the Russian competitors, like presented here by Igor Maric, because MOEX also has NRD, and NRD has a quoting center which calculates quotes on stocks, or mostly Eurobonds, and the Russian competitors. Among Russian competitors, we have myself as C-bonds, and we have C-bonds valuation, and we are using market makers and market valuations and quotes, and we are also calculating the indicative value of Eurobonds. The problem, however, is that Tatiana, as the representative of the specialized depository, has to take data from Alexei or Michael Bloomberg, but not from ourselves. And of course, here I recognize that Bloomberg and Refinitiv are companies with incomparably higher reputation and data volumes than C-bonds, but also, personally, I would like to somehow compete equally with them in terms that if we are providing a product which is no worse, why not use C-bonds if we are not inferior and if we can provide the same quality of service. This is my personal opinion, and perhaps we can ask Igor to go first.
Представляющего в том числе НРД, да.
Who also more or less represents here also NRD, although the NRD Valuation Center is mentioned in some of the regulations as far as I understand. Yes, in continuation of our previous discussion that fragmentation is a global trend, this is not exactly so, because in the developing markets, alternative liquidity centers are prohibited. In the developed markets, in the more developed markets, this is the fact of life. And in the developed markets, they are looking into a problem that this competition is not there, because alternative centers of liquidity are simply taking the pricing from the principal platform. And as soon as that principal platform is switched off, then this pricing and quoting disappears. In terms of the valuation center, indeed, there's a very interesting story there. Perhaps for such complex stories as illiquid exchange stock, where you don't have a liquidity center or any transparent pricing, you wanted to refer to something which is more or less understandable. And there, of course, you remember immediately about those recognized giants of pricing. But we have something left there. We have an information letter, we have some business which is recognized with many clients, but at the same time it is not exactly regulation. It is not really understandable whether such quoting is recognized there, whether it is the right one. And I think that it would be more logical to make some requirements for the institutions that should be meeting some standards for internal processes, for the expert boards, and for the very procedure of setting the price. Then, if such standards are met, then the client can safely use that price and quote without being asked any questions later why that price was chosen. Or maybe you can also have standards to the quotes themselves. For example, we say that if the special depository is taking a quote, but you need also to take into account this, that, and that, so that the institution which is providing such quotes really is up to the mark and the standards. That's my idea. Alexei, what do you think? Of course, on the one hand, the situation is quite comfortable to you, because you, together with Bloomberg, are mentioned directly in the regulatory rules, but there is also understanding that the situation is going to change, and you do have experience in working in a number of economies and markets. In your opinion, what would be the right approach and the right methodologies to what people should be using as quotes? Just simply quickly about the trends there. We do know IFRS 13, which really sets the fair value, the active market, observed quotes and non-observed quotes, etc. But in December of last year, the Federal Securities Commission of the U.S. introduced the so-called Rule 2A5, which identifies the pricing for the funds themselves. And if you take the U.S. context, you have very, very big funds with a lot of quotes and pricing there, and they can build their price models themselves. Also, funds have then the capacity to use several sources of information to do the quantitative and statistical analysis and, identify any deviations, and they should be reported, to the managers of the fund and then to the regulator. And in this sense, to provide such freedom to the market players would be good, because the players would be choosing those sources that they think reliable, and they would be able to consistently appraise the quality of such pricing, which would reflect on the cost of the transactions that they are doing. And see, this makes really a free choice between the various sources of information. Regarding the methodology of determining the fair value, this is based on principles. It is not really any specific requirements to an institution or a price, but these are about principles. The cascade model, which is a well-known tool, which says that if you have observed transactions on an active market, and then you have observed quotes and comparable instruments, and then you have an assessment or evaluation, and then also the expert assessment, then it is also important. Maybe you can briefly show my slide here. Here we can see the full volume of information that you need to see this fair value. What is important to the client? A, the coverage of the instrument so that it would be transparent and broad enough so that a client can make a challenge at any moment and say that to me this price is outside my statistical ranges, and can you explain why is that? And the regulator is following the same way, that the funds will need to have an opportunity to protect and defend the assessment with the fair value of the instrument. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Alexei. Tatiana, as the consumer of such information, as the end user of that information, how do you see the challenge of who and how should be used as the source of pricing information for OTC? We, as the consumer, are prepared to work with any supplier and vendor of such information. It is important for us not for that vendor to be certified by the Bank of Russia. It is important for us to see the openness of the models, that the pricing is really calculated in accordance with IFRS. And in any case, when we are taking a quote, we actually check it against adequacy internally. For example, we do check it against bids and asks, and for us it is important to explore the model and to have this model transparent. The more sources, the better. You have more competition, and the price of such services will be going down then, because the price that we are paying for Bloomberg today is unfair indeed, especially for special depositories, because the tariff was increased 6 times. 2 years ago. And since we have to use Bloomberg to us, this is really a challenging issue. This is a pain because C-bonds is several times cheaper. NRD is also cheaper than Bloomberg. This means that with the managing companies, we are reconciling assets, and Bloomberg believes that we are actually passing on those quotes to the management company, but we don't really do that. So this is a tariff for the providing of such information to third parties. Well, if you were to use C-bonds, then you wouldn't have been in the need of paying a premium on that. So, what do you see? What do we see there? Indeed, in the Russian information market, for the OTC products, we don't have the level playing field for the local and foreign vendors. Indeed, foreign vendors actually historically came first and provided a good service to our market. And for sure, we're not planning to remove them from that business. It would be wrong and unfair. But we are concerned, of course, with the fact that we need to introduce into our regulatory scope the Russian local vendors. and create such conditions. But our regulation should be then legalized to at least legalize their IDs, and also, as a maximum, to check their methodologies of coming up with the aggregate quoting. There are two conceptual approaches, and Igor actually mentioned them. This is either the users of such services that would be using these services that comply with a certain standard, or we would introduce some standards and requirements to the providers of such informational services. Which of the approaches is going to be used in the Russian reality? We really are open for discussion there. The trend, however, is that our regulation to be based on the opinion of the market, and the idea is not to harm the market, to harm something good that we already have. And we will, as you agreed yourselves, we will proceed with some improvements in our regulations, and hopefully we would choose the best way for all of us. That Russian companies need to be part of regulation and need part to be of this market. We promise to do that. Igor, it's great news. I think the session was totally a success. If C-Bonds was a listed company there on such news, you should be really buying into C-Bonds. And welcome to the exchange. Well, I mean, we need to really first identify a good exchange for ourselves. Both the exchanges and the approaches. Well, you know, you are not burdened with our regulation and supervision, but colleagues know about that, Igor and Tatiana. Yes, this is something that I'm a bit scared of, the supervision. But we are quite respectful of the business. I do have some questions on my tablet here. I will not be able to ask them all, because some of them are actually not about the subject that we have been discussing so far. The first question is about the responsibility and liability of the vendor for the transmission of data. It would be fair for a news agency to be responsible for the transmission and transfer of data. Are you planning to really increase the responsibility and deepen the responsibility of the vendor? I really think that this is up to the relations between the vendor and the end user. From my own experience, I can tell you that there are some clients where we are providing a number of information and data sets through APIs and feeds, and sometimes we pay a penalty in case of our mistakes, and this is normal. So this is not a point for regulation that the vendor has to pay a certain penalty for, say, calculating wrong return on stocks, but this is about the relations between the vendor and the end user. Here I should probably add that it is also a good practice that the fair value, its calculation should be accompanied with the methodology, but both should be checked by an independent auditor. In our case, we can provide the statements of independent auditors who would check and analyze the validity of our methodology in terms of our procedures. Another question, a good one actually, more to Larissa perhaps. Are you planning to come up with a legislation which would regulate the fair value of structured products, and if yes, when? Well, it's a difficult question. I do not think that you need a legislation to regulate the fair value of structured products. I think that the market should really regulate that itself, so we are not in the business of setting the price of such products. I think the regulator should provide for the conditions of some efficient operation of the infrastructure, including operational centers and data centers, and then, as you mentioned correctly, who would be best in this market, who would be the most efficient in that market, then that pricing would be accepted by the marketplace. Well, perhaps this is this question is more driven by those problems with mispricing. So the question, of course, is about what is a good pricing and who and how should determine such a good and correct pricing. That's why our Valuation Center suggested that it is something not for regulation. It should not be put into a law, really, but there should be some requirements to the determination of fair prices. So, but on the same level, ourselves as an institution which is providing some services, including the fair pricing of structured products, we are in agreement with. But do we have a well-developed structured market which is not really focused on one particular broker? Probably not. We are running out of time, our last minute, and the question is as follows. Do you think that access is quite expensive to the data, including provided by the international vendors? Bloomberg's is really quite costly. And I think that this problem of the expensive pricing can be decided by competition. Our services would cost really less if we have C-bonds, Refinitiv, and others on board. What about the messengers? Who is disseminating this question? Is it like a channel from Refinitiv or C-bonds, etc.? Then you can trust that information. But if this is a channel which is called like how to make $1 million within half day, then this is your personal decision whether to use that or not. This is not about messengers, but this is about the name of the channel. I do see the red sign which says time's up, and I suspect that it means that our time is really up. So I would like to thank all the participants in this panel. We did have a very lively discussion, I think, and there's something which we left with the audience and with ourselves. I thank all of those who watched us online, and I would thank all those who would be watching us in recording.
Good afternoon. Today we'll talk about the potential for the use of credit ratings for regulatory purposes and beyond. We have Vladimir Chistyukin from the Bank of Russia, Andrei Solashenko, Krytia Broker, Kirill Lukashuk, National Credit Ratings, and Karl Johansson, Analytical Credit Rating Agency. So after the 2008 crisis, credit rating agencies are gaining momentum and expanding. And that raises some questions whether supervision has to be strengthened over CRAs or introduced in those areas where it did not exist before. So let's look at the areas where CRAs are seeing more popularity. Let's start with you, Karl.
Okay, and the question deals with the current usage of rating agencies. Is that right?
Right.
Yes. So the credit rating agencies are a critical part of the financial markets in every market in the world. It's a process by which capital is allocated and hopefully a more efficient process of helping to access capital for enterprises. So clearly the corporate sector, the financial sector, structured finance, sub-sovereign, sovereign ratings, they're all utilize credit ratings to access capital and create a more efficient market opportunities. The market is relatively small in Russia, primarily because of the capital markets, but there's also now an opportunity to expand the non-traditional rating services to issues around sustainability and other things around indices and social bonds, etc. These primarily focus on large enterprises, but it's an opportunity. And it's very important, I think, in Russia that indeed the expertise around sustainability is embedded within the rating agency itself and the skills, therefore, going forward. So it's a link. Rating agencies have been and will continue to be a link between investors and the market and the capital. They do need a regulated environment, and we've made progress over the last 4 or 5 years in Moscow in that regard.
Thank you. Andrei, can you comment on this? Right. So as a representative of the market, it's hard to say that Karl is wrong. No, Karl is absolutely right in the way CRAs are used. So let's look at the recent developments. We're seeing new areas where we use ratings. Well, we are aware of the classical ones. This is financial resilience of institutions, credit or non-credit. But these are obvious stories. But what we're seeing right now is that CRAs are used in other areas too. We have a new law that help us to provide new instruments which could be accessed by unqualified investors. So unqualified investors could use ratings as markers. Well, these should not be the only markers, but that opens up new opportunities. Another law took effect, which says that we've now restricted some of the instruments based on ratings, saying these are subpar or subprime, and they should not be accessible to retail investors based on ratings. So we need to have ratings, they need to develop, but we just need to figure out how best to use them and to avoid this situation that rating is the ultimate thing, the ultimate truth. But is there such a feeling, such a sentiment among investors? Well, based on what we see, people like BBB+. Well, if the regulator said BBB+ is good, then everything is fine, you should just buy it. This is why advisory is extremely important. Investment consultants, I mean. We don't talk about them today, but at this session, but they could really add value to the market. Vladimir, what's the regulator's take? Strange as it may seem, we are basically on the same page. Nothing new. The rating agencies have recovered from the persecution from in 2007, 2008 in Russia. The value of ratings and the number of CRAs is gaining ground. It's not explosive growth, but CRAs are now becoming centrally important to assessing solvency for the retail investors. Individuals do not have their own skills, do not have their own risk management models. They need some clear, plain vanilla rules and indicators, and ratings, credit ratings, are such indicators. However, institutional investors and professional participants also select ratings as a marker. It's like a prerequisite, as a baseline condition to assess other stocks or other companies. So the rating decision is a kind of an entry point for them. And the governments are paying more and more attention to ratings. There are different rules and regulation, up to 60 rules and laws. So Andrei gave us two examples, and for me another example is the bill that sits in the parliament right now. State money or government money would be only issued to companies that have a certain rating. Currently, there are different criteria, eligibility criteria, capital and stuff like this, track record, but a rating usually encompasses everything. So a rating is a baseline indicator. Their importance is going up. It doesn't mean there are no risks, but I'll talk about the risks later on. Colleagues, we will now run an interactive poll.
Изменится или сформируется под влиянием выступлений, но, тем не менее, хотел бы получить и оценку аудитории.
So we'd like to get some feedback from the audience.
Подразумевается в вопросе, конечно же, российский рынок.
So we are definitely referring to the Russian market in this poll.
Следующий, что не возникает ли вот эта подмена объективной отчетности рейтингами не только глазами инвесторов, но и при принятии решений, вот, которых...
Here's my question. As Mr. Chistukin gave us the reason, gave us one of the examples in terms of legislation, is there a threat that the proper analysis of financial indicators of a company would be just replaced by ratings? Thank you for this question. It's a very well-established platform. It's great that we are again discussing ratings, and it's yet another signal that CRAs are increasingly important. It's good for me as a representative of the industry. So what is a CRA? What is a rating? I usually say this is an opinion, an informed opinion that relies on a certain methodology and processes and on objective analysis. Could it replace performance of financial performance? And well, to answer this question, you need to know who is your target audience. For a retail investor, well, it's partially a replacement, partial replacement. It's not 100% replace of your own analysis of credit quality, and there are negative trends saying that, well, earning a rating higher than something like this. Well, I wouldn't use the word earn and rating. The rating is the opinion of a solvency according to some scale. Now, for professionals, it's just an addition. Professionals know how to identify risks, but rating agencies do have a lot of benefits. And for the government, as a body that sets the rules and sets the trends, also for the allocation of government resources, this is an outsourcing of risk management. Risk management not really a function which is embedded in the government. So what are the benefits? First is regulation. This is conflict of interest regulation. This is independence. It's a third-party opinion which is not linked to in any way to those who acquire this risk or those who set the rules. Access to inside information. Reporting that reports are available to everyone. And rating agencies have NDAs with every customer. They can look inside, get behind-the-scenes knowledge, identify the risks. And ratings are transparent. It's not just assigning letters. They describe what it's all about. Sometimes it's a rating report, sometimes it's an extended press release. This is where we need to look at, and this is a good space for individual investors. They should not just look at the letter, but they should look at the commentary behind this letter. Not just the letter, but also the context. Yes, thank you. Well, we have the regulator's representative, and we're thinking the same way. We're on the same page. That's really good. I agree with almost everything that Kirill said, but the first of all, so for example, you read a report of the National Commission after 2008. Then definitely you would think that a rating cannot replace your own research. So the report, all the reports in the US and the EU said in capital letters, you can not only rely on ratings, but if you're an individual investor, they don't have the skills to do their own assessment. Let's have no illusions, make no mistake about it. So I wouldn't use the word replace. We just have different groups of investors, different tasks, and different users. If it's a non-pro, then it becomes key. I wouldn't use the word replace, but it becomes critical. If we're talking about pros, there's a different story. If it's all about investment, ratings could become one element. If it's about supervision from the regulator, there are different practices, tricks and methodologies in different jurisdictions. As I see it, and I hope we'll talk about how we can develop, how we can go beyond what we have today in terms of ratings. But here's what I can say right now. To assess the resilience of banks or other financial institutions, you can rely on ratings, but also on some advanced in-house techniques or methodologies that could add value. And perhaps it would add value, it would be beneficial. If we just say, okay, if this has a certain rating and then you can go the whole hog and then we'll have 45 ratings by Moody's. These were AAA ratings by Moody's. So it was good that this was stimulated by Basel, but it doesn't mean that these are transparent, honest ratings. So, bad models could also be in place, and we need to focus on them too. Well, Basel is more skeptical of credit ratings right now. The 2008-2009 crisis was called basically the crisis of ratings, and there was a G20 decision that cooled down the rating industry, saying that risk management should not be centered around ratings. Well, all the regulators usually rely on the experience of the previous crises. What about the trend today? Is it still cooling down? Is the industry still cooling down? That's a question to you, Carl.
Yeah, it's whether it's cooling down or broadening, as indicated by one of the other participants. Credit rating process is one of the elements in looking at risk and managing risk, regardless of what kind of industry you are. I do think that there were a number of lessons were learned in the crisis in 2008, 2009, and maybe you could put up my second PowerPoint, which is the framework, at least in an interesting process in Europe, which is requiring credit ratings to calculate capital requirements. We do not do that in Russia. However, some of the elements around that are very important. And so I think the disclosure, the transparency, the focus on improving methodologies is very important. And on that point, I think that's still a developing area within the Russian market. It's relatively new and young, is the methodologies that need to be looked at and the process and the application of those methodologies. And therefore, the elements of objectivity and independence and transparency and disclosure are very important in the ability to be able to use the ratings appropriately and to be able to make comparisons. So I do think we've learned. I do think there is a broadening of risk processes. It's not just on the credit rating agencies themselves. I think the agencies globally have improved their processes, but again, it's looking on methodology. If you look at Russia and the regulated environment, it's a little bit more regulated than either Europe or the US, and it's been a good process in terms of the development of methodologies. But I think we need to continue to focus on the application of methodologies and how they're used in the market, in which sector, et cetera. And that needs to have continuing conversations with the regulators. And we do have good conversations, but I do think as the markets now grow and the usage of ratings grow and expand beyond the tradition, I think that there needs to be some further conversations around methodologies and its application.
Спасибо. Thank you, Karl. Kirill, I would support what Karl said. Many say that the role of CRAs internationally is cooling down, narrowing, but Basel 3.5, the most up-to-date document, says that you can use credit ratings to calculate capital adequacy, and this option is available, it's on the table, and it's used in many countries. Those who don't use R&B approach, we know it will be the key instrument for systemically important banks, and I believe this is absolutely appropriate. As I researched in the past, I believe this is a very reasonable solution. But for those credit institutions that are not mandated to use R&B, maybe we could rely on credit ratings for this, provided that the Basel Committee allows this. But you need to study the pros and cons. As I said, the credit rating is an additional tool for analysis, including for professionals. Now, if we go back to the Russian market, there's a lot of potential in improving market discipline, and I'll explain how. Now, I have some experience in working at international rating agencies. It was a very good practice to have dialogue between institutional investors and rating specialists, because investment ratings are embedded in the mandates, investment mandates of those investment funds. It doesn't mean that rating specialists disclose any secret insider information. No, it's just about extended dialogue about what stands behind that letter, behind the particular rating. So this practice has not yet been applied on the Russian soil, but I think that's a very good way forward. It's a kind of a dialogue that could become a really good practice and it could apply not just to some particular companies, but also to the methodology overall. Karl, another question to you. What are the mandatory options of the use of ratings in different markets? Could we copy anything here in Russia? Maybe any technology that could be applied here in Russia?
So yeah, we can always learn from other markets. The markets in Russia are not as large as some other places. The mandatory requirements or ratings are also a use that a regulator can use in different settings to manage risk, whether, as indicated, the capital requirement issues of Basel. So I think as we as we look, as the market and the capital markets expand and the activity now increases, I do think the mandatory requirement of ratings has already been discussed in different segments, whether it's public money or otherwise, some high-risk market opportunities. So I do think that what's happening in other markets can be very useful for us to apply in Russia. We have the opportunity to learn from some of the other mistakes or issues, but I also think it's anticipating where the future risks are, and much has to do around sustainability of companies, not so much in the sense of green bonds, but as the markets change and the companies and the characters of the companies change, I think there are opportunities and discussions with the regulators as to require mandatory ratings on different segments and different issuance and different capital market transactions. So it can be a tool as long as there is some flexibility in terms of how we apply that. So again, as I said before, the process of looking at methodologies in other markets, applying it to our market, and then also looking at the application and comparables and developing some kind of comparables, I think that can all improve the processes and the efficiencies of rating agencies in Russia.
Thank you. Now, apart from the crisis of 2008, C-rays might have another weak spot here in Russia. They are not that big here in Russia. And the heads of rating agencies, well, don't really make too much cash. They don't earn too much here. So what is CRA? Is it part of risk management, or is it just a sales tool, a marketing tool? Because about a decade ago, we would have conflict situations when the issuer would say, I would only give you this amount of information and no more. Sometimes there would be a situation when credit agencies would be pressurized by the companies, and there would also competition between rating agencies who would give a higher rating, who would add a plus. So is it still a ticking bomb? Is it still an issue? Particularly if we imagine that rating would become more important for decision-making. Now, let me comment as a representative of the rating agents. There is a so-called 3R principles. 3R set of principles. This is regulation, reputation, and self-development. 3 R's in Russian. So that is a pillar for me that could help avoid moral hazards and other conflicts. So what is the competition between rating agencies? This is competition between opinions. These are opinions which are shaped according to some transparent rules and methodologies that work according to some policies and procedures. And reputation of a rating agency is critical here. If you cross one of these red lines, if you do it several times, the market would notice that. And professional market participants would notice that very soon. It might happen someday. And overnight, this credit rating agency would lose its entire client base. If it doesn't have credibility, it won't be solvent, it won't attract new customers. So these 3 red lines are extremely important. And 5 to 6 years ago, the industry was reset, new regulation was introduced, and there's been a lot of changes. And the Russian rating market today is a completely new dimension in terms of quality, reputation, in terms of level of regulation, the quality of this regulation.
Thank you. Reputation is indeed something that we need to remember it is like revoking a license from a banker, and then you probably meet that banker somewhere in Israel, and he is still alive and prospering. But the market saw everything until a point in time when the regulator made a decision. So in terms of this importance, we need to be sold a model. We need to understand the model. Do we have any questions about the rating models at all? Do we see some evolvement of those models? Or are we talking about the same mathematical algorithms that we used to have back some time? I do have something to say about models, and I would not go too much into those models, but I have an observation to make, which I think is quite essential and quite simple. I would call it a black box. What concerns me and what I would like to do and see to remove such concerns. Without any specific names and examples, let me recall a conclusion made by the European rating agencies once upon a time, that many would not do that, but others really need to have a capacity to reproduce what the rating agencies can do. So there should not be any black boxes, assumptions, anything that can be used by people emotionally. Really, you need to understand that you have two professionals talking to each other, and the professionals should understand that they do not really grasp the methodology, not because they do not understand what that methodology is about, but because they don't have enough information to inform that. In English, they're talking about a reproduction of such models, and I really would like for us to live in such a context. I do hope that the regulator and the rating agencies think alike. If this is the outcome of such interaction, then it would be good. So this rating model is not a thing in itself, but rather is some science, quite complex, but there are also people who would like to go deep into the science, and we need to give them a chance to do that. We need to understand the assumptions, the level of assumptions and reasoning and the transparency that we require. Then we would understand why that assumption was made, and then you can use that assumption when you are reproducing the model. This is critical and essential to any ratings, because then you can use those as markers or benchmarks, if you like, which are important for us. Carl, my question is for you, like a point of clarification, perhaps based on your experience. When I graduated from my high school, I liked the non-organic chemistry with the periodic tables of elements containing 105 elements. Now, I recently checked that table. It contains many more there. Now, ratings, are they also as that periodic table, which is supplemented by something else with more and more elements there, or is it something static?
You can put up my second PowerPoint. It's clearly not static. The elements and process of risk insights continue to change as markets change and as risks appear on the markets. And so therefore, the transparency and the disclosure and the objectivity of the methodologies and its applications become very important. So in whether the elements are 100 or 200, it's a dynamic market. It's very important that indeed, as just indicated, to understand that to get past the black box, such that the methodologies and the applications used, which should be challenged periodically by the regulators and comparisons made, because indeed it needs to be a very dynamic process. It is not something that's done, once and then left. And that's why that there's always updates. But I think we talk about transparency and we talk about disclosure and we talk about credibility in those issues. The market is, again, relatively new or young in Russia, so we still have some experiences to learn by. But I do think it's important that indeed the knowledge that's available around the world should be applied to Russia. The expertise should be developed and maintained in Russia, and so therefore this is a process that continues to grow, and the risk continues to change. So it's a very dynamic and not static process, and therefore, again, the core processes of rating agencies need to be dynamic, and we need to understand those methodologies and how they're applied in a particular sector.
Спасибо. Владимир, опять к вам.
Thank you. Vladimir, again, Carl mentioned that the regulator should be more or less following the models. In your time, there was no such an option, actually. So in your view, what is the evolution that is happening within the regulator? I also would like to take a step back, and we mentioned Basel II here, the use of ratings. Interestingly, Russia, even before the crisis of 2007-2008, or rather it was globally 2008-2009, was a very strong proponent of not using any rankings or ratings. Back then, we were dominated by the internationally recognized firms in Russia. There was no competition between the local rating agencies and the international ones. But really, Russia was one of the few countries that, when introducing Basel II, did not opt for a standardized approach, but rather opted for a simplified, standardized approach. To put it simply, they were not using any ratings. So that was quite a caution that was prevailing in the practice of the regulator back then. Now, before coming to discuss the model, I should say and mention the fundamental weakness of the whole rating and ranking business, this little wormhole which makes you not quiet in your sleep, and the payments, it is not paid by the investors or users, this is being financed by those who would like to use the ratings. But this would always call a question, and coming back to your question, because it is important for the model, whether we have a story of influence and impact on the ratings, whether you can go up or down with your rating, or whether you can sell, whether the rating agency really is focused on selling its products. I think that market and society will tolerate this for a long time. It's not that you would see an end to such an influence soon enough. So, of course, if we are able to find a solution, to find a recipe to that, then the confidence and trust to the rating industry would increase. Again, this is a weak point when we're talking about models, quite obviously. And I fully agree with Carl here that in terms of maturity, our market is very young, and this means that we don't have a good long time series, and we don't have a very good quality of data. We do not have this really drive behind ratings which would support the activity there. And unfortunately, the way we actually took account of the available data was not really proper or ideal. Rating is, of course, a humanitarian science. We're talking about a hybrid model. It's not like an exact science. It's a hybrid model, rather, that would have certain weights with some motivated judgment there. The if you take the financial market players and if you ask them about the opinion of the regulator, they would all say, we would like to have a better description of this expert judgment of the regulator to understand what it is about. But when you are talking about the same opinion of the rating agency, then the same place will say, you know, it depends on the circumstances, and of course life is changing. That is why ratings are quite different. But when you are assessing a model, you not always understand why this or that element in the judgment had a higher weight. Vladimir, you mentioned about complexity, but if put against the wall, do you think the regulator would be prepared to take this into account, to take into account the ratings? And that's what we actually are doing since 2016. Methodologically and psychologically, you are prepared, right? Yes, in all aspects, and we are doing that. We are taking those ratings into account, and we are trying to change the legislation so that things that we are doing in practice in our interaction with the rating agencies would be reflected fully in our legislation. We would like really to have more interactions in terms of the essence, not only in terms of the format. And it's not that you are saying that there was a bad motivated judgment from the regulator and you didn't take this into account. Well, there's no simple solution, but there is already a construct, I would say, for our methodology. It works like this. The regulator can have an expert judgment, but there should also be a procedure of, criticizing and countering such a judgment, an easy one, and this guarantees to the players that there would be some kind of objectivity. And Kirill, you're coming from this industry. We actually mentioned here an unpleasant example of the liability of bankers all the way up to the criminal liability. Now, what kind of liability or responsibility are you carrying in relation to investors? And I'm talking more and recalling more about the situations that we had back in 2009. If I can take a step back and really support the intention of the regulator to make some changes into Federal Law 222 in terms of the application and use of the rating methodologies and judgments. It would remove many of the gray zones that are beyond regulation and would provide for the level playing field in terms of the methodology, etc. And we do have such an experience in other countries. For example, take the European regulation of rating agencies. When they use the ratings, ESMA is publishing a broad report on the results of analysis of statistics, performance, methodologies of the rating agencies. And this is the work, in essence, that hopefully would be transplanted from Europe into Russia. And this would really have a qualitative impact on the operations of the rating agencies here in Russia. Regarding liability and responsibility, here we are talking about two types of such a liability. One is in relation to the regulator, which is fixed in various laws and bylaws, and the situation is quite simple there. If a rating agency is not compliant with the laws and bylaws, then that agency is excluded from the register of rating agencies, and this means the end of business to such an agency. This is already regulated by law, so that regulation is in place. Now, regarding the liability to investors, there we're talking about a longer path. But, of course, you cannot really be irresponsible towards your investors and stay irresponsible for a long time. Well, you might have some mistakes things like that. I'm not talking about any conflicts of interest or anything or any defaults, but some, of course, mistakes are possible. Otherwise, of course, the rating agency is responsible with its own reputation to investors. So both things, I think, are actually already a fact of life. We are receiving some questions. How do you use rating agencies and ratings when you do not have this fixed as a part of regulation with the following questions? And the question is whether rating agencies can be integrated into the system of verification of ESG investments. Maybe I should come up with a couple of comments on that. This ESG track, environment, social responsibility and governance, now today, when rating agencies are attaching a rating to an entity, they are already looking at the quality of governance. If some environmental issues might affect performance of that entity, they also take this into account. So maybe they are looking at social aspects and reputation when really coming up with assessments. So there are no really obstacles to introduce ESG principles into the rating business. But when you're talking about the assessment of competitiveness and the probability of default, to take into account ESG principles, I think that it is a difficult story. This is not a rating, but rather a ranking. It's like a doing business. You are given a ranking in terms of the 150 various characteristics. Well, this may be done, but this is not the classical rating business. This is not the decision-making factor to assess someone's creditworthiness. Well, another question. A representative of Fitch was talking about ecosystems and the various risks associated with such ecosystems. And this in the ecosystem and the rates regulation may affect negatively the ratings of Russian banks. Well, this is a question. Well, today the rating agencies, when they are signing a rating, they are not looking at a legal entity on a solo basis, but rather are looking at the group, at the partnerships, the maturity of contracts, at the prospects for business development, and many other factors. And the question is how rating agencies assess those approaches if applied to the ecosystems as was reflected in the conceptual report of the Bank of Russia. Now, we are talking about some mitigation of risks like mobilization of assets and non-core businesses, etc. All of that is going to be debated and taken into account by a rating agency. I agree with the regulator that an ecosystem is also a chance for capital to go from one part, which is regulated, to another part of the business of that ecosystem, which is not regulated. Maybe I should provide some thoughts about the way our rating agencies approach banks. Rating agencies actually like a tighter regulation because usually this means higher sustainability and capital adequacy, etc., etc. So, for the longer term, of course, this would mean that the creditworthiness of an institution would be better. And we, of course, are taking our entities that we would like to provide a rating, not on a solo business. We always take into account the partners and the whole group for that. And this is reflected in our models as well. would there be a risk that, for example, you are summoned by an financial institution and you say, can we take a look at another part of your business? And they will say, no, we cannot let you go there. This is beyond our core business. You know, for any rating agency, if your client is not transparent enough, this is already a negative factor for your rating. If there are many areas that we do not see, we a priori are more conservative in our assessment of the factors that we do not see. A micro aspect of this question of trust and confidence, you called a rating agency to come up with a rating, and then a decision is made not to publish that rating and not to make it public. This is a big question mark. People are starting to think maybe they don't want to disclose something that they don't want others to see. And we are actually hopeful that it is something that is already being analyzed. Otherwise, I may have some doubts even before a question mark is asked by the professional community. Well, the action there of the regulator to the creation and the establishment of ecosystems was quite negative. Well, I mean, the ecosystems themselves were quite negative of the interference of the regulator. Of course, any involvement of the regulator would initially be perceived in a negative way. They are saying that they are supporting banks and ecosystems, but capital should be provided there from the banks, not the depositors' money. Another good question. In February, there was a discussion of creating a repository of ratings. Is there something that is being done there? Well, it will take several years, really, to establish such a public repository or depository, and the banks will have to change their information systems for that kind of like a data center to work properly. Another important question is whether you can incentivize ratings for SMEs. That would really help with funding. I know that Bank in France is introducing such a rating system for small businesses, and that rating can be used by the creditors. The Bank of France is an institution which is somewhat different from the other central banks. It is in itself a rating agency, and not only for the small business. We are trying to discuss this point in some practical terms, but we don't have any breakthrough there, because we started to be thinking maybe the users of the rating would start to help and pay to obtain a rating, but we did not find a final solution whether the SMEs would be prepared to pay for that. But we do need the SMEs, and we do need to provide funding to the SMEs. So my short question in the end of our session to all of you about this expert judgment. Do we have enough regulation of the rating business in Russia? And we do see the results of the voting that 36% of those who responded think everything is okay with this regulation. Then only 5% are saying that there's nothing to be done there. Karol, you have a view of a person who has international experience. Do you think that the level of regulation is enough today? Is adequate?
I think is your other question dealing with the chart in terms of the number of issues that affect ratings. So I think the process with the Central Bank of Russia in developing methodologies and reviewing and the market itself has been good. I think the process needs to continue. There needs to be a continuing dialogue with the central bank on those issues that become important. As we've already talked about around sustainability and those factors and how you measure it and what's disclosed and the scope of that. So I think it's been a good start. It's clearly adequate and has allowed the credit rating industry to establish itself. I think in our conversations, we think there are opportunities not necessarily to increase the regulation, but to refine the process and have a dialogue in different elements. So given we've been here 5 years. We need time to continue to develop the process. But I would say that the regulatory relationships have been good, in that the start has been good, and we now need to look at the next or second or third or fourth level of those particular elements that should have a conversation, whether it's formal regulation or not. But I think the conversations, as any regulator in any part of the world, you learn something as you come through a crisis. And it's not necessarily that you need more rules, but sometimes you need more discussion and understanding of what happened. And so therefore, I think an ongoing dialogue, as we are doing in certain areas around methodologies, in certain areas around disclosure, and comparing and mapping things and looking at national versus international. There are a number of areas that we can continue to develop in terms of default probabilities, et cetera, such that the results of the credit rating process, whether it's a credit rating or other rating, actually improve the overall capital markets and the efficiencies of what goes on in Russia. So that's our objective. We've made good progress, but we continue to need to have a dialogue.
Thank you. Kirill, the same question to you. Are you regulated adequately and enough? We do have solid foundations that radically changed for the better the rating industry. And what we are discussing today in terms of the draft law on the improvement of the rating methodology, we think that a similar step can be made to improve the rating industry, and I fully support any initiatives for that. And Vladimir, in terms of the regulator, what do you think? I'm very close to what Kirill said. We do have the fundamentals in place. We need to do some fine-tuning. And here, I will probably highlight the independence of the rating agencies, methodologies, and the efforts to make some impact. So 3 points that to keep in mind. Okay, now we are done with our session, and we are going to have another session.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants and the audience of the International Financial Congress. Today we'll talk about blockchain versus custody services. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Congress for this opportunity to discuss the current status and the prospects of the settlement infrastructure of the financial market. And thank you for coming up with this brilliant name. It does carry some suspense and maybe even some conflict. That's fine. Let's figure out whether there is any conflict, any confrontation, what are the changes in the settlement infrastructure going forward and in the longer term. Today we have distinguished experts that are well equipped to discuss this. Yuri Dubin, head of depository at Sberbank. Next to him is Petr Lanskov, head of BOD at Lanskov. Tatiana Medvedeva, Center for the Development of the Stock Market. And online with us is Nikolai Kolodiev, CEO of LDSoft. We also have our colleagues, experts, the front row participants, Alexei Fedotov, Head of Strategic Development and International Financial Institutions Relations at Best Efforts Bank, and Boris Cherkassky, who is an aide to the CEO at Infinitum, that's a dedicated repository. Throughout our debate, we'll turn to our colleagues to share their perspective. The organizers allowed us to run a poll for the audience, so please could you bring up the first question of our poll. There are 4 options to this question. In 10 years, sorry, this is the right question now. So for depositories and registrars, the blockchain is something that will dig them in, a settlement institution, or these institutions will become the operators of the distributed ledger. And the 4th option, what is blockchain? Okay, and as you vote, we go back to our discussion. Blockchain emerged 10 years ago, both the technology and some examples. And the professional financial community has been abuzz with this new word. And infrastructure is no exception. So will the distributed ledger make settlement infrastructure redundant? Will it help to address the issue of credibility? And will it also address the issue of intermediaries? Will there be a new asset class? How can the infrastructure value chain be modified, affected by the new technology? Both internationally and domestically, experts have debated this issue, introduced different prototypes, test runs, looked at applications, wrote overviews, reports. The International Association for Services in the Stock Market set up a working group that looked into this issue in an extensive way and published a series of papers on this. That looks at potential horizon and when we can finally see this technology in place. Today we know a little bit more about this technology. We have some practical experience. We've also studied its practical applications in junction together with other technologies. And the regulators have set up regulatory sandboxes. There are other trends, the digital ruble and other digital currencies of other central banks. So that's another dimension of this trend. There have been a series of scandals related to it. There have been some fraud issues. There have been disappearance of the founders of crypto exchanges. And we know at least someone who's lost the keys from the digital wallet and lost access to his or her digital assets. So during this panel discussion, we'll try to look at the impact of the new financial technology on the market in general and its registrars, depositories, and its infrastructure. Are we in for a revolution that will see a new trend towards de-intermediation, decentralized settlement infrastructure, or is more of an evolution with a more gradual change that will see infrastructure meeting the expectations of the market and its end users? Do we have the results of the poll? Can you bring them up on the screen, please? What we're seeing right now is that most of the votes are in favor of the second option, one of the new instruments. But there's a large share which believes that it's just PR and nothing else. So maybe we can take these results into account when you, the distinguished panelists, share your perspective. Piotr and Yuri, I'd like to put my first question to you. So is the current settlement and custody infrastructure relevant to the new products and services? We see there are a lot of new technologies which have an impact on customer behavior, the way we use taxis. Retail products have changed a lot. Knowledge acquisition is completely different, and there are more and more retail investors in the financial market, and the banks and brokers set new customer journeys for them. And they use the one-click approach. Is this one-click journey safe and convenient enough? Unfortunately, formally, we are not yet there, but is the infrastructure to blame or not? Overall, the infrastructure is ready to provide this one-click service, but since it was established and designed in the 1990s, registrars have a so-called superstructure, a lot of regulations, a lot of rules, norms that describe the pre-digital life of infrastructure and settlement and registration institutions. So there is a gap between the current realities and regulations. We would be happy, and we are actually ready to do that, and we have asked the central bank to repeal some of the paper age-based regulations requiring physical presence of a customer for his or her identification. Seems to be strange. So a person who's thousands of kilometers away cannot come to the office. Remote identification is now possible, but it's the predecessor of the central bank that had a decree that mandated personal presence, physical presence. So there could be thousands of users, but we cannot service them because they cannot come to our office. So if we can repeal most of the regulatory outdated norms and get rid of the hurdles that stand in the way in reaching out to the new generation of customers, That would be great. Well, there are thousands of new customers. Will they come to the office and, register themselves? No, they will use the services of a broker who can do it for them. So they would use the intermediary. We could have avoided the intermediary, but we cannot do this at the moment. They would like to continue living in this digital bubble. So they have gadgets, they have the internet. We could do that, but the regulation doesn't allow us to do that.
Ваш взгляд на эту тему какой?
Те вещи, о которых говорит Петр, они безусловно.
What Peter said is indeed a reality. It's true.
Вы сами сказали, что.
But you said yourself that we have 10 million individual investors, and they buy stocks and bonds in one click, and there is post-trade settlement. There might be tension, there might be issues, but the pace of growth indicates that people are more or less satisfied with the current infrastructure. And the infrastructure can handle that inflow of customers. Here's what I would like to point out. So you talked about the new taxi models, food and breakthroughs, disruption. Why don't we see this in the financial market? The financial market, indeed, is one of the overly regulated markets. I agree with Petr. It's a huge market. It's a well-developed market. It's an economically developed market.
Не могут изменить, и вот те участники, которые выходят, условно говоря, на рынок такси, они могут себе позволить.
New entrants in the taxi market can first set up the infrastructure without asking consent from anyone, and then get consent from the stakeholders later. But the financial market participants cannot afford this luxury. Everything is really tight. It's well regulated. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but given the scale of the market, perhaps it's good. So if I order a taxi, if I hail a taxi, for example, and I, touch some of the icons and get the result that I need, I don't really think of what's behind, what are the algorithms and computation behind this screen. So change in logistics, new contracts with transportation companies, motivation of the taxi drivers. If I don't think about this, if we copy this model to the financial market. So I like the instrument. I see the rating, and I just put them in my basket, virtual basket. So is it not possible to do this? I mean, to make sure that there is the behind-the-scenes infrastructure to make this one-click game possible. So we can't really change because you say the legislation is too conservative and is based on the models of economic relations that belong in the past. Is that your message? Well, it's not always conservative, or not everywhere conservative, and thanks to Tatiana, we have had a new series of laws that would enable new platform, digital asset platforms. That's a new law, 5259, and they open up new opportunities for existing financial institutions. And thanks to Tatiana and other experts, I, with my passionate eye, do see that these laws are convenient for registrars, for depositories, so we can actually assume, we can put on this digital suit, this digital tuxedo, instead of the old 1990s coat that is worn out. But we need further analysis. The law is the key source for this norm, for this reality. the central bank is one of the sponsors, and that would lay the foundation for the future operators. So you always have a huge pyramid of rules and regulations, while the new operators, the platform operators, the digital assets operators, will operate straight from the new law. So COVID is a major hurdle right now, but the mentality of the depositories is still not there. So usually it's the regulator who drafted rules, but right now basically these operators can do it, and that's something unique to the market. We need to be able to find investors ourselves, investors that would like to invest in digital assets. Fine, we have several components, ingredients of success: technology, the regulatory framework, and changing the mentality of the operators. That would allow them to use the first two components and change in response to the realities, to response to the new behavior. Tatiana, regulation has been mentioned several times by the speakers. A lot depends on the regulator. There have been huge changes 10 years ago, and they are now increasingly relevant.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот в разных странах по-разному же решается вопрос о том, как подходить к регулированию новых.
Different countries have different models in terms of setting up new assets.
Жестко выносится суждение о том, что применяются стандарты.
Some countries apply standard stock market rules. Some use a more nuanced approach. What is the position of the Russian regulator, of the Russian legislators? Will new legislation stimulate the emergence of new assets and instruments? Thank you, Maria. Our lawmaker has chosen its own path due to what we saw in the past. Unlike Germany, we've long used paperless securities. In 2019, in Germany, for the first time, they got a report. They issued a report which said, "Oh, it's time to get rid of the certificates." I think they have not really gone to the paperless certificates, to the paperless securities. Actually, we are ahead of them. You can use blockchain, you can use custodians to keep track of the securities in the digital era. So we did that before. And we have gone through that path. We needed to incorporate the new realities, the new assets in the old legislation. Currently, what we're talking about is this distributed ledger and things like this. We call it the new object of law. We don't call it security, because previously securities were distributed into two elements. These were paperless securities and cashless items. So why did we do it? Because every object was subject to its own regulation, depending on its nature. Any security, with a certificate or without, confirms your title, your ownership rights. But there is different regulation. If you want to hand over your certificate, paper security, paper-based, you need to just hand it over physically. But if it's a digital form, if it's a paperless form, you need to send a request to depositories, to custodians. So securities have long lived in a new era, in a new environment, and we're really surprised by the opinions of regulators in Germany and France. Blockchains could have been used for this purpose. It might seem natural, but you also need to understand what are the risks. There are quite a lot of risks. Could they have been overcome when we introduced amendments in our legislation? No, we cannot do it even today. So you have two sets of relations with different regulation. We have two types of assets, bonds, for example, and stocks. You have paperless bonds and you have stocks as digital. They're also paperless, but, well, we call them digital assets. They're still assets. They still are a symbol of a particular type of rights, but in terms of our legislation, it's a different element. You cannot use any intermediaries. You need to contact an information system. You cannot use intermediaries. That's bad. It doesn't enable you to circulate these digital rights. It's hard to do it without any depositories, without intermediaries. You have to hand over the keys to someone to be able to do transactions in a fast way. That's the way it is. And Piotr is right. We need to start working with these two instruments, digital bonds, digital stocks, and we'll then figure out what the risks. And there are a lot of risks, and we need to overcome them. And whether investors are ready to assume these risks, this is critically important. Losing the keys, as you mentioned earlier, the inability to use them as assets, currently doesn't work. Maybe they will learn it to do it somehow, but today they can't. It's a property right. What do you do in legally wise? So you can. So how do you know the code? How do you know the keys? You know. How do you push the person to relinquish that kind of property? So there are a lot of issues which we still cannot regulate. How do you ask for these keys? Torture a person? Well, it's all about trust right now. I agree with Piotr that it's high time to set up new legislation and get rid of regulating processes. We need to regulate outcomes. Currently, we regulate processes. 3 days for this, 3 days for that. You put a tick there, you put a signature in this log. We need to require and punish settlement and infrastructure and depositories for the outcomes, for the results. We cannot control the interaction between different computers and different servers. So we might have a single ecosystem where a lot of depositories and custodians will connect and they will interact. And they will keep all of the transactions on their side, all of the transactions in the financial market. That's my vision. Thank you. Now, I've been listening to all of you, and both Nikolai and our first row participants, we're all specialists in this area, and we are belong to the conservative old school.
Именно того, как могла бы измениться жизнь, ну, которую мы знаем, и как.
Well, we are discussing how our life can change. But is there a danger that, influenced by the bans introduced by various individual investors and the ambitious brokers, there might be some fintech solutions coming up based even on new laws that would prove to be efficient in blockchain systems. And the regulator says, see, I mean, this is a peer-to-peer efficient way of interaction. So we may forget about the traditional infrastructure and use just blockchain for our transactions. So we're talking about some scenarios for future. I was talking about a caretaker, more or less, approach, and but that fintech provides such a solution, and this might happen actually without us even understanding this or seeing this. That's a question that I have. Well, I would say that there might be some value chain, the OTC market, the registrar, the regulator. We all know how to more or less live with each other. What if even the individual investor needs such very fast transactions? Well, whatever, we are just following the procedure. We're going from one link in the chain to another. But does this mean that new technologies may more or less remove us from the scene and quite unexpectedly to us? You know, I really faced big chain when I was reading through a report for Euroclear in 2016, which depicted an absolutely different structure, where accounts are at the same level, where transactions are within one day, where the architecture is very flat. An ideal picture, I would say. The consultants were claiming that theoretically the blockchain technology makes such an ideal picture possible. But then various other questions emerged, that in theory it is okay, but it would probably not work in practice. And people were saying that it might happen if there's some disruptive event happening and people would be talking to each other directly, if, of course, the regulator decides that it is the way to go. So we had several options of how this is going to happen, but all those options turned out to be quite complex, because you have technological challenges and the blockchain of a decentralized, fast and secure transaction. You can, out of the three, choose only two, not three. So the story where you have to choose between the speed, security and decentralization, then the market would rather choose and opt for security and speed than decentralization. And of course, people want to have money in that system, because without money, it makes no point. And you also have to manage this beautiful new world, and then you need to agree on how this is going to be regulated. Well, it was, to remind, back in 2016, in about 5 years' time, people claimed there would be the first signs of such new world, and then probably the fully fledged system would be created in the next 10 years. Now, 5 years later, and realizing where we are, they probably really were correct that 10 years is really too optimistic to have such a happy situation with us by then. That meaning that it is going to happen, and with our immediate contribution. If you trust Oliver Wyman, the author of that report, then it is undoubtful that the regulatory factor is one of the most essential ones, and the dynamics of change would depend on the position and attitudes of the regulator, and the market will still remain heavily regulated, at least over the horizon of our vision today. Nikolai, we are discussing the scenarios of the future, and we are saying that blockchain is a technology which can provide a solution to the fundamental problem of trust and confidence in the validity of various records and data, and people who are driven by analysis, they are talking about some single environment. Nikolai, as the practitioner, as a person who has been long involved with the market, do you think that blockchain could be a panacea to the request and demand of the industry for security, for speed, and for lesser cost? Thank you, Maria. Indeed, my view might be quite different, or maybe it is different. It comes from a different angle. I'm a technical expert, and looking at this technology from the technological point of view. We have lived without blockchain now quite happily, and we're able to find proper solutions. However, blockchain is also a very interesting technology which compiles in itself certain infrastructural solutions for very specific tasks. And what are those tasks that are proper for blockchain? These are the systems that are well protected and secured against data distortions. These are the distributed systems that are resilient to attacks or to loss of parts of infrastructure. Those systems are functioning as systems with dynamic architecture. But what is the weak point of those systems? As it is often the case, merits are also weaknesses. This distributed infrastructure means that if part of this infrastructure, of the system, if the different parts cannot interact with each other, then the system itself, in its completeness, becomes non-functional, non-operating. So this is a critical element, and of course then
в учетной инфраструктуре, вернее, она получается комбинирована.
The system itself is more or less combined in terms of the recording of data in it, and this means that it is important for us to appreciate any dangers and threats to the system. And here,
мне понравилось деление Татьяны на две категории. Я бы тоже разделил именно на две категории.
And here I would really try to categorize the reporting and recording into two parts, and perhaps I would call it differently.
Первая группа — это отношения между эмитентом.
First, it is the relations between the issuer and the investor, which don't have a direct effect on the asset management of the investor. That is like, leveraged money, including equity, maybe stocks, and these are the relations that are based on the return on investment. If you take the classical instruments like stocks or anything else, then there you can also manage the business of the issuer. And hence, especially if this is an entity which is considered to be of strategic importance, we need to also think whether a situation may occur when the failure of all systems, if the attack is against all the nodes of the system or against the data transmission lines, and there is such a danger still, I think, and of course, on the one hand, it should first be assessed so that the infrastructure can withstand such attacks. But also, on the other hand, there are people who should be thinking about such a crypto threat, because this crypto threat would really disrupt the whole infrastructure of the opponent, and this would in turn affect the management and the operation of the facilities. So, if you take that, if you would sum up the tasks of the first category, there the blockchain is ideal for such approaches to implement such solutions. And indeed, blockchain is ideally suited for that and should be given green light there. But regarding this Group 2 or Category 2 tasks, regarding the security of such systems so that they can provide for both the recording of data, the handling of data, and the continuity of such processes, then the system should be segmented, and only then would it be able to provide enough and adequate security, because it would be difficult to attack its individual layers and segments. And what are those layers and segments? I think trading should be put separately, and the recording of transactions should be also separate. Now, if you are building one single blockchain system, then we are not really following the decentralization way. It is a system which is distributed but not decentralized. It is rather centralized because we are putting all the eggs into one basket, and all those eggs can be broken if we drop the basket. Now, the kind of situation is, if you analyze the infrastructure of our market, then it is fully in line with our tasks of the second category. On the one hand, the trading is separate, but and the transaction recording is decentralized, but this decentralized registering is in the interest of the client, and every registrant servicing a set of those registers. So such an infrastructure does not have a single point of failure. In a blockchain system which really integrates all such functions, would have such a single point of failure and would be vulnerable. Now, what can be done in relation to what we have discussed so far? We do have an infrastructure which is proper. We don't need any technologies, one may think. But this is not the case. We do see that the system is really developing and using all the technologies that are within the grasp of its developers. Registrants are actively developing a system of personal accounts, which is the solution for this whole system to ensure the speed of management. Through the personal accounts of issuers and users, services become accessible. In the market today, we have a new phenomenon, which is also built on blockchain technologies, a system which provides a packaging for such a segmented infrastructure, which in essence ensures something and provides something that we never had before. It's a single window for the management of all assets. An investor can, well, the infrastructure is now starting to face the investor. It is more or less turning from the issuer to the investor. Through such a single window, the investor, without hopping from one service to another, can manage all the assets, take part in various corporate actions, and interact with the institution. And the system routes all such interaction automatically. It knows where the registrant is and addresses all the requests to that registrant. We have a point of clarification for you, if you may. The question is as follows. The thing is that, in essence, it is the issuer who has to take the decision that the servicing and handling of its papers, securities, will be done by the system. So it is supported by the entirety of institutions and systems. It is the issuer who has to open that single window that you were talking about. But most of the issuers, but not even most, but all of them, would not even suspect that such a single window can be there, that there is such a template for a single window that you developed, and we don't know how they would behave if they would learn about such a single window, because it's a single window that would provide access not only to its data, but to the data of others issuers, and maybe there would be a concern that the data would be freely accessible by all within that mechanism. Well, indeed, if the system would have received information, registering information for the purposes of storage and use, then the issuers would have the right to veto the establishment of such personal accounts. However, the investor, we're talking about the investor, it is his or her personal account office, and the request is sent to the registrant. By creating such an account, the request is sent to the registrant, and who more or less provide information to the investor, not to the issuer, who has nothing to do with that. So the question is indeed who can be the driver of change. Piotr mentioned the issuer, Nikolai mentioned the investor as a person who is requesting such information here and now, and to add something new and bigger to the traditional services, and the registering institution is a chain in that value, is a link in that value chain, and blockchain can really have an impact on trade and pre-trade and clearing. And I would like to ask the engineers to connect to us further so that he can share his views about the future value chain and how this is going to affect the development of infrastructure. Can you see me? I hope that you can hear me. Maria, thank you for your comments. Let me be brief there in my comments. Indeed, I would include many participants of the market into that chain. Depositories, custodians, and many of those types of depositories, brokers, dealers, registrants, central bank, DPCs, and primary offering platforms, they all have some economic sense and value to the country, and they transfer the value across the chain. So it is not only interesting within the blockchain technology. And the second thing, when we are Looking at this chain, there was this report by Oliver Wyne, but there are also more relevant and recent reports that are interesting. But in any case, it is important to think about where we are. 10 years ago, we were talking about this very hyped idea of blockchains and cryptocurrencies and crypto assets to replace central banks and everything, with so many good and nice-looking scenarios. Unfortunately, many of those scenarios never materialized. When we're talking about the main characteristics of blockchain that are so much favored by the fans of this technology, I mean, those remained unimplemented, and of course the integrity of data can be achieved through much less scary methods. Of course, some cost reduction sometimes turns into higher costs. Our consumption on bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies mean that it is very difficult to handle by depositors. Smart contracts need to be verified legally, but who is going to do that, etc., etc. And I'm not there to criticize the new technology, but to describe the situation where the hype is over. And then we face a phase of concept testing. We are past that phase as well. We are now into phase 3, where we are testing and checking individual use cases. And this indeed impacts the scenarios that in turn have an impact on the full chain, not only an individual depository. The report by Oliver mentioned that in 10 years' time we would have a different market, but the roles of the participants would remain, with some disruption and change and transformation. And this is indeed one of the most comprehensible scenarios. Alexei, I'm sorry, we have only 1 minute for you. Okay, then I should be quick indeed. I would say that the most feasible and plausible scenario would be that the listing instruments would still be popular digitized, assets would be popular, primary markets would be destroyed by blockchain, and the functions of brokers there would be destroyed. And T+0 settlements would also destroy the role of a central counterparty. Any centralized institution could be quite efficient, may not be affected by the blockchain. Digital assets like Bitcoin and others, they would be marginalized. Looking at this future scenario for depositories, there would be broad vistas, and they would find some new areas where they can get income, like, for example, storage fees, etc. And many say listing would disappear, and all unlisted assets would be issued as ICO, and there would be primary and secondary markets in blockchain, but digital assets would not be predominant. And a statement that I wanted to conclude with is that public blockchains, they would only increase the expectations and understanding of the scale and cost of automation. They also inform us about which assets need to be digital, and they also identify the areas that should be subject to blockchain and new technologies. And also, most probably, we can expect that these technologies would influence in a way that new issues and new markets would look like ICO. This is like a mixed model, not a single model. Thank you, Alexei. Indeed, it's a very interesting opinion and picture for the future. Maybe we can have a look at the second poll that we had for our audience.
Да. Очень интересно. Вот, пожалуйста, вам итоги нашего...
Quite interestingly, the outcome of the voting. In 10 years' time, the registration would be supported by fintech. 57% of the audience said so. A single entity, 28%, and 7% said that depositories will become the operators of a blockchain system. Now, these are the prospects, really, colleagues, that the audience set for us, which is quite different from the story that we pictured ourselves. The first and third responses are not alternative, that operators need to be... The registrants should be the operators of platforms. So this is probably an evolution. They would turn from registrants into operators. Summing up, indeed, the evolutionary way would be the most probable way, and that the registering institutions would be evolving towards the operators of platforms, most probably, and their status as the center of trust would be used by them in the new quality and role. And this way, they would provide for a seamless transition from the old model to a new model. I would like to thank our audience for their attention and their proactive contribution, and I would also like to thank panelists for that interesting discussion that we had.